So what was the news of last week? What's his name? Richard Hanania got canceled because he was posting racist stuff or sexist stuff in a previous life. And oh my God. And then Matt Iglesias got into the mix, sort of the right wing or the left wing Hanania, and then almost got canceled because at some point he had liked one of his tweets or something. Like that whole little shit fit about little Substackers having little fights online. It's like, this is ridiculous, right? There's no there, right? None of these people, well, I mean, I guess the left does, but none of these right-wing sort of rabble-rousers have like a constituency or a political movement or anything behind them at all, right? It's like, I mean, and maybe some of their thinking gets into the zeitgeist obliquely, which then does influence policy, maybe, but it feels fake in a way. I think I said this in the chat earlier. It's like it's still the end of history in the United States, just that the end of history in Europe, in Paris, by the way, which is gorgeous. And the riots, there was no riots, there was no anything. It's ridiculous, the overreaction to all that. Paris is still the most gorgeous city in the world. In Europe, the end of history is this beautiful little museum that's very nicely administered that you live in, and it's kind of quiet and a little boring, but it's magnificent, right? In the US, capitalism still runs 100%, 100 miles an hour, but everything's kind of a mess. And you still have, the men with hollow chests beating their chest, like to quote Nietzsche's phrase about the last men, except in this case, they have Substacks, right? And they sit there and they beat their chests, and that is their job, to beat their chest in the end of history. But nothing's actually going to change. Nothing actually happens.
I like how, 3 Latinxes on the pod. I'm the only one who's ever on time. And then Antonio's basically been podcasting on the group chat on his way to the podcasting recording studio. So I really don't know what's going on here.
Yeah, he does this effortlessly.
Yeah, y'all just are missing out not being in a group chat with Antonio, because I don't know how he can peck that out on a phone. Like mine's littered with grammatical errors and typos, and he's kind of just writing chaos monkeys in the group chat. On the end of history and which way Western man. We should talk about the Zuck-Elon fight. I mean, that's always an interesting topic.
Well, first, why don't you share your quick analysis? You saw Dustin Moskovitz's comments, right? Like Elon hasn't really done much to speed up SpaceX and to space development. Maybe he's even slowed it down or something. But at most, he sped it up like a year or two. He's basically saying that when he critiques Elon, he hears the response back of, hey, Elon's done so much via SpaceX and Tesla that he deserves a pass, so to speak, from people who disagree with him or think that he's making a big mistake with Twitter. Why is Dustin insanely wrong there?
There's some similarity in that Dustin made money from somebody else's endeavors by attaching himself to a rocket ship. And I guess Asana is about a $5 billion company, so you shouldn't, that's successful. It's a public company. It's still a going concern. But I don't think a guy who built a task management software company, there's really any place to be opining on someone who took rockets, which hadn't ever landed back on Earth successfully, turned that into a pedestrian thing, right? Like this happens multiple times per week, right? I think SpaceX is on a rocket that has gone up and down 20 times without blowing up. I think SpaceX now represents 80% or greater of all kilograms put into space. And so this is stuff that only nation states could do. And they're doing routinely, profitably, encouraging the creation of a whole new set of companies and industry. And then, by the way, he also has this company, Tesla, which is 60%. So all of the rest of the car companies in America, storied car companies, ones that have union jobs or whatever progressive thing you want to put, they sell fewer combined sell fewer electric cars than Elon, right? So the climate change movement, effective altruism, like we need to do all this stuff. The person who's single-handedly moving the needle to make a large chunk of emissions, and he has a whole plan for a whole bunch of the other sources of carbon emissions. The one who's actually done the most practical progress towards reducing fossil fuel in average everyday American life is also Elon. Come on, like I just go back to your task management software.
He has a whole, of course, his philanthropic organization that has a lot of smart people there doing good work, I'm sure. Flesh that out a little bit further in terms of like what are the effects of his donations there.
I'm not an expert on everything he's donated, but I think he's behind, decarceration, progressive prosecutors, and I think it's worth separating some of those issues, right? And I think we've talked about it on the podcast before, but and we talked about this with Noah, where you have decarceration, which starts from a good place. Probably shouldn't be putting people who have these kind of like small marijuana-based offenses in prison. So get those people out. But then you get down this crazy slippery slope where now you're letting all these convicted felons out on no bail, or right back out onto the streets, and they're doing all this terrible stuff. And you can search Twitter for all of the terrible stuff that happens as a result of not taking someone who should probably be in prison, but before they are kind of convicted of that crime through our judicial system, they should be in jail, right? So I think the fact that you would even try to be defending that at this point, it is a failed policy. And the people who are disproportionately impacted by those policies tend to be people of kind of lower socioeconomic and minority status, right? You don't have the convicted felon who's getting out on no bail, showing up in some really rich neighborhood and doing something bad. What they end up doing is they end up, killing someone in their own neighborhood, or preying on other people in kind of disadvantaged situation. And so I think you have to have some baseline of law and order in society. There was an interesting tweet that someone showed that they took 5 cities in Europe that are super progressive from a drug law, the way they treat things. And I want to say it was, one in Portugal, maybe it was Lisbon, Amsterdam, Vienna, a couple different places. And one of the consistent things that all of these countries had was they have really aggressive policing around open air drug markets, right? Like, so they would never let something like the Tenderloin happen. They also have safe injection sites and all these very progressive things around drug policy. But the fact that people are not just showing up in the Tenderloin and cleaning up the drug dealers who are just hanging out on the streets, it's crazy.
It's interesting. There used to be a big debate between sort of like, should these philanthropic organizations focus locally on, cities like San Francisco or Detroit or within our country that are really struggling, or should they focus in sort of third world countries that have, much bigger problems? Like, I think that was a question, but that debate has even gotten further magnified, I think, within the EA community, because EA has, pursued kind of this long-termism approach about, what about caring about future people? And what about focusing on existential risks, whether it's AI or sort of other, pandemics, et cetera, other sort of potential risks that could happen in the future. And some people are saying, well, that could happen, but also we have major problems here and now. And so I think these organizations are wrestling with how to allocate, capital to where you can have the biggest impact, not just in today's, sort of, people, whether it's in third world countries or here, but also in terms of tomorrow's people, future people, as it relates to existential risks.
I think people should have the freedom to do with what they want with their money, even if I disagree with how they spend it. Like, they earned it, they should be able to, or I mean, some people earned it, but you earn it, you pay your taxes, do what you want with your money. And if you want to go do stuff outside the U.S., great, right? I think Bill Gates has done an amazing job with polio and malaria, and like that I think is a huge net benefit to humanity, and good for him for doing that stuff. I think we should be focused. Our problems that we're focused on should be focused through our political process in the U.S. and that's where we should be holding people accountable. So if you're the one funding kind of these crazy prosecutors who basically don't believe in crime, I mean, just look at what's happened in San Francisco. They put and this actually might even be a mayor policy mixed with the prosecution side of things. What is it? $900 is not a crime. And so you just turned every single Walgreens into, just go and do whatever. And then there was that viral clip, a week or two ago, where I think it was in Stockton, California. So it wasn't quite San Francisco, but you could kind of lump most of California under this pretty progressive view towards crime. And the guy had I think a trash can, and he was just stealing stuff from like a local gas station or bodega type place. And then the 2 shop owners beat him with a stick. And at first, like the viral clip went out, and then it was like that the shop owners were going to be investigated for assault of someone who was stealing stuff from their store. And then I think it came out later that they realized that was going to just blow up in their face. But I mean, if you can't have like a basic version of like, this is against the law, we are going to prosecute that.
Yeah.
Society starts to break down. Right. And fortunately, we have a system in this country where there are a whole bunch of other states where they think that would be crazy. And what is dysfunctional in San Francisco doesn't have to happen in a state like Utah or, Texas.
Mark was pessimistic on Gary Tan's efforts when we had him on the other episode, and we should have Gary at some point on. Are you more optimistic, or how do you conceive of like the counter, the resistance in San Francisco, so to speak?
I don't know. I think Mark has a lot of wisdom in how he kind of approaches the stuff, where there's a lot of hopium when people see stuff. They feel like they're in the moment, like change is now. That said, I think maybe I'm a bit more optimistic sometimes. And I do think Gary is actually kind of in the freaking trenches right now. I saw some Twitter exchange where he's like calling some guy like a racist and just like going after him because that guy was going after Gary for being rich. And it's like Gary grew up, I think, like on, I don't know, food stamps or so he's kind of a good rag to riches, like worked his ass off and got to where he is. And so anyone trying to attack Gary Tan for being kind of like wealthy, it's like, no, dude earned it. And now he's actually putting a lot of effort back into trying to make San Francisco. I mean, Gary Tan is, I don't want to speak for Gary, but like my sense is Gary is like very much a Democrat. He's just not crazy. Basically, it's like the crazies in San Francisco think Gary Tan is like a fascist. Right? Yeah. He's just like, okay, like, this is just crazy. But I mean, I think he's pretty serious about getting Dean Preston out of there and a couple of the supervisors. The question is, do they flip enough of the seats?
I'm curious if we could talk about him before he comes. Like, what is your story about why he converted to Judaism, or like, how do you make sense of Antonio's like of decisions, or what would be interesting to talk about Antonio when before he comes or when he's not here to our audience?
I think what's interesting about Antonio is that obviously he's extremely well read, and he's not just kind of randomly picking Judaism off the shelf. Like, grew up in a Cuban American, or I guess Cuban immigrant household, like very Catholic area. Went to, I think, a elite Catholic boys high school that Fidel Castro had been the equivalent, I think, in Havana. That's where he had gone. And so kind of like very much rooted in that tradition. It has the secular component in that he's extremely educated, like PhD dropout in physics. And then I think well-read on the literary side. So I think he can blend a lot of different things together. And what I find fascinating about it is well into life, he's making the decision to convert to Judaism. So at least for Antonio, it seems like he's found some truth or something of value there. And I think that makes me reflect and say, it's like, like what should I be looking for something like that? And not necessarily Judaism, but my own version of, some version of self-discovery.
It is pretty insane how well-read Antonio is, and that he's also like a crypto startup entrepreneur, and previously a YC founder a decade ago. If folks have read Chaos Monkeys, they'd know. Just kind of this eclectic set of skills and interests.
Yeah, I mean, he's an interesting guy. He's lived like his cat. He's lived 9 lives. I think what is interesting though for me is you do definitely have periods where if you're not on the grind of a startup and you do take some time off in between, or something that's a little less structured, depending on how much you want to apply yourself, you can get a lot done, right? Like I want to say I read 100 books in the year and a half that I was off, and not 100% of it, flipping through, and consumed a lot of other media, really got into cooking, got into cycling. Like you start to fill the time up of that 8-hour, 10-hour workday every day. Like you can actually start to get interesting pretty fast. Where the hell is this guy?
Hey,
Luke, who decided to come.
I have a good excuse this time, though. As a little example of the anarcho-tyranny that I'm mired in, I literally last week found my car with a parking ticket and a broken window. I literally had to go drive to the middle of nowhere, Bayview, Hunters Point, to go pay for a window replacement and also have to go pay a parking ticket for the broken into car. That's the state of the world in 2023 right now.
How was your trip to Israel?
Yeah. But how's all the other countries in the world? Well, I have to say, I spent a week in Europe, in Paris, and a week in Israel, and I have to say they were an interesting contrast to the state of America. Be pleased to hear that I was in the Blue Bottle across the way here, and somebody recognized me for MOZ and said I should be on more shows. So I'm actually, at least you sent agents that are nagging me in person. It's happening organically. So here we are.
I haven't been recognized for MOZ yet. Like what? I guess I'm not in the right place.
You don't go outside it, Dan.
Yeah.
You're in LA. I bet more listeners in SF. Antonio, before you got on, we were just reflecting on the impact our show has had. Like, why do people listen? Like, what role does our show fill? Dan was just beginning to weigh in.
I don't know. I think our show, you have people who are kind of in the inside of a lot of what's happening in Silicon Valley via the group chats, as we've talked about. I don't think anyone's kind of the main character, which is probably useful, right? Like, I think some of the other more prominent podcasts maybe in tech that have somewhat of a similar format, like they can actually be the main character in a given week or right there. And so I think that creates maybe a little bit more, I think they have to hedge their statements a lot more. And I think we just kind of say what we think rather than having to kind of worry about, this constituency or that constituency. And I also think we treat our listeners like they're smart and actually make them do work, right? So we're going to give a reference here or there, and then you go look it up on Wikipedia if that's interested to you. We're just going to keep moving rather than trying to go one-on-one on every topic and appeal to maybe a wider audience.
It isn't just the All In podcast, but like 10 IQ points higher. That isn't still true. Isn't that basically the pitch?
What do you think, Eric? I mean, we're part of your growing podcast media empire, so I'm curious where you see MOZ fitting into your lineup of shows here.
It's definitely a idiosyncratic, iconoclastic show. I hear a lot of people who come up to me and say, hey, I just checked out Tom Holland, or I just checked out Joe Henrich, or who's this Curtis guy, or I think we are like a gateway drug to like different ideas or different rabbit holes for people to go down. I think people get smarter about SF. I think people get smarter about some of these kind of like broader things around religion, broader things around like politics. I think for like the techie intellectual or aspiring, curious person outside of just business, there's no other show like it in my network or separate in terms of like the range of topics it covers, I think.
What other show has source material where you wake up on a Sunday morning and there are 300 unread signal messages from the group chat between Antonio and an unnamed person arguing, future of Western civilization?
Which almost made me break up with my girlfriend, by the way. But yeah, okay, yes. By the way, your network, Eric, you're talking about this thing like you're fucking Rupert Murdoch at the head of the news corporation. It's incredible. So how big is this? What, tell us about this Turpentine business. When is it going public? When are you doing a hostile takeover of the SF Chronicle? Like what's going down here exactly?
Right, so we're still, still very early days. We have 8 shows. Moment of Zen is the biggest one. The other ones are largely more niche or category specific. And that's what we're trying to do is create like category defining business media, basically. And we're starting with podcasts. I have a co-founder who's amazing. Her name is Amelia Salyers. She used to help lead editorial at Andreessen. She did the Future publication, and she also helped run their podcast operation with Sonal and others. And we've got a team of 5 full-time people. So we're cranking. We have a lot of shows in development, and excited to expand beyond shows into newsletters, into events, lists, kind of like a full-fledged media operation.
Wait, so is there going to be an MOZ summit?
If you guys give the heads up or the go ahead, there'll certainly be a MOZ event.
Well, we can't do it on Shabbat.
Yeah, we can't do it on Shabbat. I love how we're the biggest show in the network. So just to use an analogy, we're the Tucker Carlson of your Fox News, just to be clear. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Okay, that's great.
Well, Antonio, give us the update. So you haven't been on in a month or so.
That
What's
long? Fuck. Okay.
Well,
Yeah,
no,
sorry.
you were on the Mark episode, but
Oh,
you were
right,
from
that's
like a tin can in Tel Aviv or something. I forget
Yeah.
what was going on.
But yeah, people want updates with you too. Antonio, why don't you give the Spindl update and yeah, just where your head's been at?
Oh well, Spindle's cranking. I won't bore you with the details of Web3 attribution analytics, but yeah, for business reasons, I was in Paris. I was in ETC. ETC is this big crypto conference, it's the biggest in Europe. So I was in Paris for that, which was big. We put on a big splashy event, a lot of meetings, and it's odd to be walking down the Boulevard Saint-Germain and be recognized for like some crypto techie wonky thing. Possibly the first time in French history in which techies have like met each other, like or like, hey, aren't you da da da? Next to in the middle of the Latin Quarter in Paris. It was a fun event actually. It was really enjoyable. And then after that, I went for a week to Israel, partially for personal reasons, partially business. We just did a partnership with an Israeli company in Tel Aviv. And given it was close, I thought I'd go. It was also a Jewish holiday called Tisha B'Av. And it's one of the tragic days in the Jewish calendar in which you sort of mourn the destruction of the temple, as well as a bunch of other horrible things that have happened in the Jewish calendar. If you don't quite believe divine intervention, if nothing else, just the birthday paradox would make it such that in the history of a several thousand-year-old people, it just so happened that a lot of bad things happen on one day, and the 9th of Av is that day. And so for that day, what you're traditionally supposed to do is go to the Western Wall, which, to remind everybody, is the Western Wall of the former temple, and go there and kind of mourn and read the Book of Lamentations and sing songs, etc., which I did.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
Are you building a business? Well, if you haven't already been asked by potential customers or investors about things like SOC 2, ISO 27001, GDPR, or HIPAA compliance, well, guess what? You will be. Achieving compliance can actually unlock major growth for your company and build a foundation of trust. And Vanta can help. Vanta automates up to 90% of compliance work, getting you audit ready in weeks instead of months, and saving you up to 85% of associated costs. Vanta scales with your business, helping you successfully enter new markets, land bigger deals, and earn customer loyalty. And bonus, our Moment of Zen listeners get $1,000 off Vanta. Just go to vanta.com/zen. That's VANTA.com/ZEN.
If you're a startup founder or executive running a growing business, you know that as you scale, your systems break down and the cracks start to show. If this resonates with you, there are 3 numbers you need to know: 36,000, 25, and 1. 36,000. That's the number of businesses which have upgraded to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, streamline accounting, financial management, inventory, HR, and more. 25. NetSuite turns 25 this year. That's 25 years of helping businesses do more with less, close their books in days, not weeks, and drive down costs. 1, because your business is one of a kind, so you get a customized solution for all your KPIs in one efficient system with one source of truth. Manage risk, get reliable forecasts, and improve margins. Everything you need all in one place. Right now, download NetSuite's popular KPI checklist, designed to give you consistently excellent performance, absolutely free, at netsuite.com/zen. That's netsuite.com/zen to get your own KPI checklist. netsuite.com/zen.
So yeah, it was interesting. It's funny. We live in this. I think one of our favorite on the official MOZ bookshelf, probably up here somewhere, is Bruno Maschai's book about history has ended or whatever. I always forget the title because there's a different title in Europe versus here. But basically saying that we live in an elective virtual reality in which Americans are basically opting out of reality. And it's funny. I think he's more and more right every day. So it's funny to kind of get out of that reality and get jarred into a world that's having real conflict like Israel and see the sort of virtual version of that in the United States.
Antonio, so I'm curious, given how much time you spent working on the conversion to actually make it back to Israel, because you had been there once before, but a long time ago, any new perspective or anything that you were surprised about?
To set the scene for those who aren't following the Israeli news, there's this massive nationwide political confrontation, so to speak, over this judicial reform. Just to get the very short version of the deal, Israel, doesn't have a constitution. It has a sort of basic set of laws, but it doesn't really have it. odd considering a people that has nothing but a founding document and which is the most covenantal thing in human history. Somehow they actually don't have a constitution, even though of course they have the Torah. Two, I mean, the right is basically winning, and the right-wing coalition is winning and is slated to win probably for the foreseeable future. And two, you don't have the balance of powers of judiciary, executive, and all that stuff in the United States. You literally have a sort of Supreme Court that has taken for itself lots of power to basically nullify any lawful law that actually came through the parliamentary process. And to those that are for that, that's considered a checks and balances is necessary. And for those who are against it, it's an anti-democratic thing. So the big debate is basically, do we nuke the Supreme Court and its ability to nuke legislation, or do we not? At its core, that is the debate. And what that means, of course, is, again, a lot of things in Israel are flipped from here. The Supreme Court is naturally leans left and secular and liberal. And the parliament now is controlled, or the Knesset is controlled by a right-wing coalition that has the Haredi, i.e. the people with the black hats, the very Orthodox, has religious Zionists, has Mizrahi Jews, the Jews from Arab countries that are very different than the Ashkenazi Jews. There's a right-wing coalition that is in some sense opposed to the left-wing Ashkenazi / Europeanized constituency that has ruled Israel since its founding, basically. And so much of the same, a lot of the feeling was kind of similar, felt like a rerun of the Trump thing in the United States. Not exactly. And again, I've often railed against like turning every external issue into like an internal US one. So the mapping is a little bit iffy here and there, but broadly speaking, it is the case that you're seeing a revolt against a liberal elite through the populist mechanism of semi-direct democracy. That is a little bit what's going on. And it's funny, liberal elites, as they start losing elections, right, and having their strength undermined, like, exercise the same tropes in the same way. Not necessarily unjustified, to be clear, but the vibe is definitely, après moi le fascisme, to use, Louis XIV or Louis XVI. Think about, after me the flood. Well, after me the horrible fascism is going to come if we don't retain power. The other thing they do is that they frame their ideological enemies as the worst possible elements among them, right? We were to believe during the Trump election that 46% or however many Americans voted for Trump were all like knuckle-dragging white supremacists and stuff, and kind of not the reality if you kind of see the United States. And ditto in Israel, they cast the right as nothing but, super conservative, black hat wearing Jews who are living in a pre-modern period of time, which isn't quite true, right? Like, again,
have they got to the point where they're accusing the right-wing Jews of being Nazis?
Yeah. Not yet, but it's funny when the left threatens to move, instead of threatening to move to Canada like they do here, they threaten to move to Berlin, which is really quite ironic, which is an irony. It's funny. In Israel, it's become quite normalized, and it's understandable, by the way. Berlin is kind of the center of gravity in Europe in a way that you can reinvent yourself, but it is a little odd, right, that the country that was founded literally as a reaction to the Holocaust is in some sense fleeing back to the capital of that country. And it's funny.
Well, did you share the clip where it was like a bunch of people in Berlin, like Free Palestine, they basically like, here's like a point of view. People in Berlin shouldn't talk about stuff in Israel. Just like leave it off. That you can talk about a whole bunch of other issues. Like Germans probably shouldn't weigh in on Israel like anytime soon.
I don't know if I'd go that far. I mean, Germany has paid reparations for years on end to Israel as part of the process. So in some sense, they have skin in the game to some degree. But well, God, that was an accidental pun there. But in any case, getting back to the Israel thing, it was funny to see that sort of liberal cosmopolitan elite encountering the traditionalist, particularist, anti-that faction in very real terms. And again, what's different about it in Israel is that in the US, Trump or whoever can win is like almost the statistical fluke of this weird bipartisan system we have, right? But it's not like the right is slated to win forever. If anything, it's a revolt against, what is by default a kind of left of center society. In Israel, it's different, right? Israel is one of the few countries in the free world, or whatever you want to call it, broadly the West, that is leaning more to the right and more religious over time. Right. And so Israel was founded as a secular socialist project. Right. But after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, the right-wing bloc started winning elections and has more or less run the country since then. The traditional left-wing party, the sort of far left party, I think didn't even get a single Knesset seat or maybe 2 or 3 in the most recent election. They basically don't exist anymore. The hard left doesn't exist anymore in Israel. And then it's also getting more religious. And so And it's not just a Haredi, right? You have people who are Orthodox, who are observant. Some of them are what are called religious Zionists. So two of the biggest leaders, a guy named Smotrich, another guy named Ben Gvir, they're not the sort of black hat wearing, Jews that you associate with whatever, the ultra-Orthodox, as somewhat the misnomer that's used in English. They're integrated with society. Their children serve in the army. They have jobs. They're not living on an island, but they do embrace, real Orthodox Jewish life. And that stands at odds with the Tel Aviv spirit of open, liberal, cosmopolitan, whatever. And Israel is an amazing place. The aesthetics are magnificent. You go from Tel Aviv, which is this kind of rough on the edges Miami, right? But for the price of Singapore, by the way, the place is super expensive, with like a Silicon Valley plopped into the middle of it. So imagine Brickell, Eric, right? So like a few of these like gleaming towers in Brickell plopped into the middle of Tel Aviv, surrounded by what is kind of rundown-ish version of Miami. And again, super fucking, that's Tel Aviv. And then, you get on this beautiful train, by the way, which now connects Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. You can practically commute between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. You go to Jerusalem, and it's funny. To me, it was a radically different experience. It's more beautiful in some ways. It's more traditional. It's all built in this beautiful Jerusalem stone, so it has this brilliant yellow to it. It's in the Judean hills, so it's in high desert. Kind of reminds me of where I used to live outside of Reno. These beautiful craggy ridges and pine trees and stuff. It's really quite cool. It's what you think of the Holy Land. There's this thing called Jerusalem syndrome, that people go to Jerusalem like pilgrims and get overwhelmed and think they're Jesus or that they've seen God, because it is this overwhelming spiritual experience, right? I don't know, man. Jerusalem looks pretty cool. Like, what's so wrong with it? You're just supposed to describe it as this hellscape, but it just doesn't seem that way. And later on in my stay, I actually got kind of bored of Tel Aviv. And so I just get in the train and go to Jerusalem and just hang out there. And it was just, to me, it's just such an interesting, colorful place. Okay, I'll stop there because there's probably questions there.
No. I mean, I took 8 months off between kind of Coinbase and Farcaster, and we traveled, and the first place we went to was the Middle East. So we started in Jordan, then we went to Egypt, and then had to work our way back to Jordan to get to Israel. And it was the first time I'd ever been in Israel. Started in Tel Aviv, which I describe as like Miami mixed with LA, and kind of, you don't have the humidity, right? But super cosmopolitan, fun place to go. And then we went to Jerusalem, where we were actually there on Shabbat, so nothing was open. There was one restaurant open for like schmucks like me who were there, because I didn't have any place to go to eat, so we had to get this like bad pizza or whatever. But one of the most kind of like powerful things for me was we went to the Mount of Olives, right? I'm not Jewish, I'm Catholic, so I was like, okay, let's go actually see Gethsemane, and then, but you have this amazing view of the entire kind of old part of the city still in the walls. You have the Dome of the Rock, and then you also have this giant Jewish, Israeli flag on the top of this hill. And then there's this whole story about that's actually a group of settlers on this side of Jerusalem, which is an Arab part of Palestinian part of Jerusalem. And so you have the whole like kind of set of conflicts, and then you're sitting up there and you kind of are like, okay, Saladin could have been on this hill looking at Jerusalem, 1,000 years ago, thinking about, okay, like I got to go kick out those Crusaders. And then you walk down the path, and then you're looking at olive trees that in theory were around at the time of Christ. Like it's a mind-blowing place.
Yeah, it really is.
Can I point out one thing that it's really interesting? I'm assuming the left in Israel would love a constitution right now. Like, it's something that would kind of check the power. Whereas the left in the U.S. is loving the idea of like getting rid of parts of our constitution, like the electoral college is corrupt, like let's change the Supreme Court, like all these kind of things that the constitution's pesky for them. On the left in Israel would love to have a constitution. I just think that that's kind of funny.
I mean, the reality is that principle goes out the window when power politics have come to the fore, right? And you become a strict constitutionalist or a strict judiciary oversight person, depending on who controls the court or who's writing the Constitution. And otherwise, there's not a lot of principle to it. So, yeah, I don't think a Jewish constitution is ever happening. I think it was basically avoided when the state was founded because they realized they would never agree on it. And there was too many other pressing issues. Literally the night after the declaration of the state, they were bombarded by Egyptian airplanes. So it wasn't exactly the time to sit around and haggle over a constitution. And since then, I think everything has been improvised in Israel. But again, it was fascinating. Let's get to what I think is fascinating and how getting back to my Uber point about how politics in the US have become largely a LARP, right? Is that like, in some sense, and not taking a side either way, really, but the right that we're talking about does want to back off from liberalism a little bit. And if by liberalism you mean secular universalism, right? In that sense, they are pumping the brakes on that and saying, no, Israel's not going to be a Western style Enlightenment state like any other, right? This is a Jewish state, not a state of Jews, right? And that's a different sort of state. Doesn't mean it's not democratic, but it just means certain problems will be tackled a very different way, right? And I think that's real in a way, that the right in this country, right? Like, we're all spent too much time online. So what was the news of last week? What's his name? Richard Hanania got canceled because he was posting racist stuff or sexist stuff in a previous life. And oh my God. And then Matt Iglesias got into the mix, sort of the right wing or the left wing Hanania, and then almost got canceled because at some point he had liked one of his tweets or something. Like, that whole little shit fit about little Substackers having little fights online. It's like, this is ridiculous, right? There's no there, right? None of these people, well, I mean, I guess the left does, but none of these right-wing sort of rabble-rousers have like a constituency or a political movement or anything behind them at all, right? It's like, I mean, and maybe some of their thinking gets into the zeitgeist obliquely, which then does influence policy, maybe, but it feels fake in a way. I think I said this in the chat earlier. It's like, it's still the end of history in the United States, just that the end of history in Europe, in Paris, by the way, which is gorgeous. And the riots, there was no riots, there was no anything. It was ridiculous, the overreaction to all that. Paris is still the most gorgeous city in the world. In Europe, the end of history is this beautiful little museum that's very nicely administered, that you live in, and it's kind of quiet and a little boring, but it's magnificent, right? In the US, capitalism still runs 100%, 100 miles an hour, but everything's kind of a mess. And you still have, the men with hollow chests beating their chest, like to quote Nietzsche's phrase about the last men, except in this case they have Substacks, right? And they sit there and they beat their chests, and that is their job, to beat their chest in the end of history. But nothing's actually going to change. Nothing actually happens. Well, in Israel, there's something really at stake, right? If this reform goes through, it will be the case that Israeli law will change, and the direction of the country will change in profound ways. And you go to Tel Aviv and you go to Jerusalem, and they present different pictures of the future of Israel, right? And that's just not the case in the United States, at least in my opinion.
Are there any other Western countries that are at that level of change?
I mean, everyone cites the Hungary example, Orban maybe, but it's just so small and
yeah, I mean, it's
kind of unimportant in the scheme of things. It's like, who cares? But
yeah. Let me counter on the Richard Hanania point in terms of offering an alternative, only because he has a book that just came out. It's called The Origins of Woke. And it's a good book. And he basically makes the claim that there is a set of laws that enabled and strengthened and cemented wokeness in kind of modern corporations. And it's not only this just kind of like intellectual fashion, but it's actually the law. And it's been the law for some time. And he identifies in his book the exact ways in which it could be overturned, or the law could be overturned. And you then have people like Chris Rufo and Vivek who are advocating for just for exactly that. And we just had affirmative action rolled back. So, I mean, it's still liberalism. So he's not offering like a post-liberalism, but he's making it, he's advocating for very specific legal maneuvers, practical legal things to make US a more liberal place. If that's your goal.
Okay, so this is the book version of his Wokeness to Civil Rights Law or whatever post that went viral last year, right?
Yep.
Which I did read, and which I think Matt Iglesias commented on. That's probably why he got canceled or whatever.
Wait, so I just wanted to check: are we allowed to talk about Richard, or are we now going to be canceled by proxy for even talking about him? Okay, just checking.
We're fine, and he's fine too. I think cancellations are over. I think there was I think he's going to be even stronger for it.
Streisand effect.
Hold on, but he's a little impervious to cancellation because he doesn't actually have like a job, right? Like that's the other thing. Like, canceled means what? I guess he would lose his Substack. I mean, he doesn't actually have like a real job, right? Never
I thought when you don't have a job or you get fired from a job, you start a Substack.
Yeah, but that's I don't know. It's
it's not only that, but back in the day, or a few years ago, it's not just that you would lose your job; it's that people would disassociate from you. But we don't see Tyler Cowen or Brian Kaplan or Barry Weiss or I don't know, people who...
Well, Barry Weiss, Barry Weiss disavowed him. University of Boston or whatever disavowed him. And is he going to get pieces in the New York Times published going forward? I'd be very surprised by that.
Probably not.
So, and maybe it doesn't matter.
Okay, so let's actually get back to the argument. I just wanted to be clear. I didn't want to be canceled by proxy because we're talking about someone who's been canceled, right?
We do not endorse all this stuff.
Dan, you're gonna have to kick yourself off Farcaster. That's what's gonna have to happen. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to nerf myself.
Commit seppuku.
Okay, yes. So I do think it's funny in this new right, whatever. I think there is a split between Hanania sort of and Rufo contingent. I think is still safely in the world, and in fact, in his sort of apology comeback tour or whatever, he mentioned that he's still a liberal, right? He still embraces that, although it's kind of a classical liberalism with slightly eugenic properties. Let's be clear, right? Which is kind of anti-liberal, but and then Rufo is incredible what he's done from a purely objective, like one man making things happen in the world. Rufo has been this one man media army who has scored legislative successes left and right. He absolutely has. So I think you're right to push back on that side of it. If you look at the broader right, though, and maybe there is a split between the sort of activist liberal right and the slightly more delusional or sort of fantastical right. I'm thinking like people like Sohrab Ahmari of Compact Magazine, Adrian Ramuel, who is kind of a Catholic integralist, even Patrick Deneen, who I like, by the way, and I think I've plugged his book before, is of that mold of, they literally call themselves post-liberals, but it's not clear what that post is even about, other than reimposing blue laws such that stores have to close on Sundays or something, which is like one of their big hangups. And in that world, that's where I really am dubious. And it's like, what are you being post about? Everyone's still living in the little Whole Foods bubble, right, of comfortable liberal life, which is why nobody really wants to leave it. It actually is quite cozy, right? Like, what is the alternative? And again, outside of the religious right in Israel, which is its own very real vibe, you can go to Israel, you can go to Jerusalem and see it. I just don't see what that means, other than Rod Dreher, who I guess props to his at least being consistent, actually moved to Budapest, I think, right? So however small Hungary might be as an island of whatever they stand for, he at least is kind of living it. But other than that, what does it mean? What is the post-liberal thing, right?
Yeah, Roger, for the audience, famously wrote The Benedict Option, which talks about how if you want to have a religious life, just go make it happen. Go make or live within a community that can operate within the modern world, but under your pre-modern or your own principles. Right.
Which, as far as I can tell, nobody's done. I mean, other than the Amish, of course, we're always living that, or the Mormons. But beyond them, what does that mean? And to be clear, I tend to agree with them that liberalism definitely has certain shortcomings. Patrick Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed, is a fantastic book, recommended by Obama even. And I think it's probably the best sort of Jeremiad against the flaws of liberalism that you can ever read. If I wanted to direct someone against, to read in that direction, I would definitely suggest Deneen's book. But it's not clear where that leads, to be honest. Even today, I was reading this book by, what's his name, Buskirk from Stanford. He's another kind of interesting, from the Claremont Institute, I think. And is all about American dynamism. At the end, what he suggested was basically crypto, Web3, interesting one city ideas like Miami. That's kind of interesting. But it's like, it's not clear where that spark, where that revitalization movement, if you want to call it that, of either straight line liberalism or whatever the post-liberalism is supposed to be or come from. That's why I think it's kind of a LARP. There's nothing really happening. There's nothing going on. There's nothing at stake, right? The vector that we're going on is not going to change.
Yeah, the only thing that's actually happening is the Silicon Valley, right? Like,
correct.
Yes.
Just
technology is the only thing that's kind of interesting and moving forward, and everything else is just circular and kind of rehashing. And I know we don't talk about that guy, the plagiarist, but like refinement culture and nostalgia, like, and all this other stuff that basically is just like we can't actually innovate new. And the only thing that's innovating new is Silicon Valley and tech.
And just for the audience, Paul Scalise is who he's talking about, aka LindyMan, who is a great packager of ideas, and sometimes he's too good
of ideas. There we go.
Sometimes he packages a little too faithful to the original rendition.
Noted Islamic scholar, yes, packager of ideas.
Austere Islamic scholar.
Religious. Right? You get a job at the New York Times writing headlines, Eric. This is amazing.
Yeah. maybe we should share that in joke. Who was it? The leader of ISIS got drone striked, and the Washington Post referred to him as an austere religious scholar instead of a terrorist. Yeah.
And if people aren't getting the Scalise joke, he literally plagiarized entire lines, like copy pasta, from my post as either his tweets or in his posts. I was literally like control effing and finding my tweets actually, in his post.
Solana's too. Like in real time, we were just realizing that he did it.
Yeah.
And then he got kicked off Substack.
because
And then I totally lost it and did this whole thread on it that I still get likes on. People are still looking up the thread where like the LindyMan got booted or whatever. And I just totally lost it and went nuts, and they kicked him off Substack. But I think he came back or something. He's alive.
Yeah,
somehow.
he's not,
He's
now with
on-
X, he has creator monetization, man.
He's on Beehive. I subscribe. I've forgiven him. I like his stuff. I'm rooting for him. Have you forgiven him, Antonio?
I'm just, there's a great line in GS Elevator, which is a source of all wisdom online. The best revenge is not giving a shit. I haven't even thought about him, to be honest. I don't know.
He's the Don Draper meme. I don't think about you at all. But anyways, I think refinement culture, though, is an interesting point in the sense that, like, just look at Hollywood and like all the stuff. And that's actually, I think, one of the interesting things about Oppenheimer, Barbie, was the fact that like you had two movies that weren't sequels to other things, and that there was like an intellectual element with Oppenheimer that actually became somewhat of at least an online conversation. When was the last time a movie did that?
Well, hold on. But I would say, just to rehash the decadence point, there's two types of movies that exist in the world anymore. It's either rehashes of past glories, typically in World War II, or basically superhero fantasy movies. That's it. And each one of these is safely within those genres, right? The glories of the Atomic Bomb Project and literally Barbie Land.
Yeah, now you're going to look at Mattel and they're going to go, okay, every single toy we have, just like the Marvel universe, you're going to get the Mattel like content universe, and it's going to be awful. I mean, I think Nintendo had the same thing. It's like they had like a Mario movie that did really well, so now you're going to see all these additional things. But it's like, where are the original ideas, right? I don't know. I think actually television has some of that now. Like, if like compared to film, it feels like the prestige TV is actually a lot more original.
Dan, are you implying that the inner life of Waluigi is not, or is it Wario? I can't remember. They're doing one of the Mario characters.
I don't know. We know Sriram will watch all the movies and tell us that they're great.
He just did that. He just did that with Spider-Man like 20 minutes ago.
Yeah, he was like texting. He was like, "Oh man, the Spider-Man movie's great." It's like, dude, like I stopped watching comic book movies like 10 years ago.
Dude, are you 12? Like, what's going on here? Aren't you an adult with like a job? Like,
And kids and all this stuff.
No, Sriram's good because he's a good. He keeps us abreast of cultural issues.
Yeah,
that's right.
We're just ripping him so he comes on and talks to us about it. So yeah, post-liberalism, LARP. It's basically liberalism or religion. You're going back to pre-modernity. There's nothing in between, or post.
Dude, I don't know. It's a little bit above my pay grade to like figure out why is it that we haven't invented a new religion recently, other than things like Scientology. I guess Mormonism.
Climate change.
There you go.
What about transhumanism? Do you think that is any?
It's definitely it's a form of Gnosticism, right? Gnosticism being the strain within Christian and other thinking that the corporeal is evil and should be abandoned, and that human life should exist in a purely spiritual realm, and through that achieve immortality. That basically is transhumanism, and there's elements of that in Christianity, right? And so, yeah.
Antonio, it might be worth an aside here. Isn't it kind of interesting that, like, because you went to Catholic school as well, like you learn about all these like weird heretical versions of Christianity, like, and you kind of like are bored out of your mind in high school. And then if you actually have any baseline on some of them, you can start to map them to all these different secular groups now. And it's like, wait a second, like you just reinvented this like thing from like, 7th century France. Like they had those people, and actually they did a crusade and they killed all of those people.
And you almost wish they would bring back the burning at the stake business to just settle the matter once and for all. But in any case, no. I mean, I've often argued that the real reason for a religious education is just to recognize religious thinking when you see it. And again, a lot of the people in the thrall of religious thinking now just don't realize that they're rehashing heresies from centuries ago all over again.
Yeah.
Including Christianity itself, which is a little unauthorized spin-off move from Judaism. But leave that aside. This messianic cult that got a little bit too big. But yeah. Eric, what's going on with the hair? Your hair is just getting more and more wild. How has nobody commented on it? Sorry to be that guy, but this is insane. This is kind of I kind of like it though.
I go through phases, and I'm just growing it out until I can't take it anymore, or other people can't take it anymore, and it's close. But we'll see how far I get. Antonio, I want to make sure that we get to what we were just talking about in the chat. Basically, so you were saying the woke will win. Skirmishes here and there, red states like the gerontocracy and deep state aren't going away. Like, do you think that's an interesting thread?
Yeah. I mean, to get back to the like why I think a lot of it. So maybe I'm just getting fucking tired of the Twitter fucking circus, or I think partially triggered by again seeing places that actually have real sort of political, turmoil to them. Is that nothing's actually changing. The gerontocracy is still there, right? Like Charles Schumer and Pelosi and Feinstein are still in power, even though some of them are even semi-sentient. The basic political orientation of our elite institutions is the same. Yeah, maybe there are skirmishes here and there with Roofer or whatever, but there's no dramatic change in any direction coming. I think it's just we're going to settle into a period of relatively affluent stagnation, right? Like I don't think it's actually the end of the world. That's the other thing, right? Like there actually isn't a crisis going on. The same thing struck me with Israel. Everyone's talking about it's the end of the world. It's like, motherfuckers, you realize in the 1967 war, your parents or grandparents were literally digging ditches in their front yards to like fight to the death before getting pushed to the sea. And you're getting a little snippy about the fact that you managed to lose the last election and therefore I'm getting on a plane to Berlin. It's like, are you people out of your minds? Like, in many ways, things have never been better for Israel, right? Like, the Palestinians didn't come up in any conversation even once because, to be blunt, politically, they don't matter anymore. They've been basically contained and that's it. It just doesn't matter to the political process. Every Arab country that historically would threaten Israel's survivor is basically a skeleton of an actual state. Syria is a failed state. Egypt is quasi-failed. Jordan is kind of hanging on. Lebanon is a Hezbollah colony, basically. Israel has nothing to fear from its immediate neighbors, right? And its GDP per capita is higher than Germany's at this point. It's thriving as an economy. If anything, it's a problem. Things have just gotten too expensive and not everyone is joining in the prosperity. Similar problems in the United States. And so there actually isn't, other than Iran, right? There isn't an existential threat that's breathing down Israelis' throats. And yet the sort of like the screechiness and the volume of the political debate and the hysteria of it is like cranked up to 11. The same way that it is in the United States. And it's unfortunate because I think a lot of I think the real danger, if they were to ask me like, okay, Antonio, what do you think is a real problem here? I don't think it's the judicial reform. I think, here's another thing. Here's another little anecdote. I did 2 Shabbat dinners when I was in Tel Aviv, both secular Israelis, like people who work in tech, like, oh, not those crazies with the black hats. They both did a totally canonical Jewish, kiddush with the cup and the prayer and the little kippah and the whole thing. The secular Israelis were more observant than your average American Jew, right? And then I went to a Tisha B'Av breaking a fast with an Orthodox family, and they did the same. They weren't actually that different at the end of the day, right? The Tel Avivian Jew and the Jerusalem Jew at the end of the day is not that different. Here in the U.S., the red and blue tribe live in like different moral universes, like completely different worlds. In Israel, the only difference is the guy you're talking to is married with 3 kids versus married with 8 kids, but that's it. They're both still doing the Shabbat dinner thing with a little wine and the candle on Friday. And so it's just bizarre to me that they're interjecting this level of just political dysfunction and fragmentation in a society that actually isn't, in my opinion, naturally that fragmented.
Were you sympathetic to the Yell's take that this shift rightward is going to last? Like there might be some initial pushback and people leaving, et cetera, but that for the next decade or 2 decades, like this is going to hold?
Yeah, man. Demographics are destiny. Like I said, like the secular Israeli had 3 kids and the religious one had 8 kids. And that's just what it is. I don't think it's going to change.
I feel like there were concerns at one point that Arabs were having more kids and that they would outnumber, but no.
Modernity kills everything it touches. They too got touched by modernity, and their birth rate went down. I mean, I think Arafat had a famous phrase that the secret weapon of the Arabs is the womb of the Palestinian woman. It's like, well, I don't think that's been working out so far. I mean, left unaddressed in all this, of course, is the whole West Bank Judea situation, what to do with the settlers. But
what is the point of view for people in Israel? Like, if you were to kind of synthesize, or maybe in each camp, like what do people think that you should do with the West Bank?
Yeah, my general feeling, this is very anecdotal, but just talking to people on both sides. On the right, the feeling is, we'll see, which I think is their oblique way of saying, we're going to win in the end. Just support the settlements, have more Jews live there, and eventually we're just going to be slowly annexing. Like in the US, many of the debates in Israel seem to be virtual, about things that aren't even real or that are already decided, but that become major rhetorical fighting points. So, for example, the left is in a tizzy about the annexation of the West Bank. Dude, I was there in 2005. Okay, almost 20 years ago, driving on the West Bank. The West Bank has been annexed. It's by any sane meaning of that word. It's controlled by the Israelis. You just drive through. There's no border checkpoint, right? The only exception is a few cities are kind of walled in and controlled in theory by the Palestinian Authority, like Jenin, et cetera, where like the Israeli army doesn't go into. But broadly speaking, it is an extension of Israel. We crossed into the West Bank because the traffic to get back from the protests from Jerusalem was too much. So we cut into the West Bank to just get get back to Tel Aviv faster. If that's not annexation, what the fuck is, right? It's ridiculous, right? That's just the reality on the ground is that the West Bank or Judea Samaria, what do you want to call it, is an extension of the Israeli state, right? There's no other way to look at it. And so the only question is, well, what do you do about that? Do you make them Israeli citizens? Do you let them vote? I mean, there's a lot of particulars that are undecided. The reality is that I don't think there's an answer there. You talk to the left, and they're like, no, it's an occupation. It's like, okay, but and then, well, what are you going to do? Like, oh, they should have some level of autonomy. But the two-state solution is deader than dead. No one actually thinks Palestine will have a sane democratic regime that the Israelis can live with, right? They just don't. And so that's not a solution either. I think there isn't a solution, is the reality. And that on the same trend line, you're going to have more settlers. And you can quibble over, part of what Ben Gvir, the extreme right-wing guy who's in the current government, is crack down more on, stronger on the Palestinians in the territories. And that's kind of a debate point. But I don't know. This takes us back to, I think, a conversation we had previously, the difference between Christian and Jewish narrative. There's a great book called People Love Dead Jews by Dara Horn, one of the best writers about contemporary Judaism in my experience. We should have her on at some point. I had her on my podcast ages ago. And she says, Christian narratives are about happy endings, right? The Gospels are the biggest happy ending of all, right? It's the apocalyptic end in which Christ returns and institutes the kingdom of God on earth, right? How does the Jewish Bible end? Moses gets to the promised land, does a little bit of inheritance and probate work, and then dies. And that's it. And it's totally cliffhanger. You've been following this tribe along for 5 goddamn books. And at the end, you don't even know what happens at the end and whether there's actually a happy ending or not. I think Jews are a lot more happy with tortured, unclear, morally ambiguous endings. And that's what they're comfortable with. We'll see. We'll see what happens in 20 years. That's the view.
Is modernity a death cult everywhere except Israel? Like, is every other country not reproducing above replacement rate, or like, and why is that?
I bet Richard Hanania has thoughts on that.
Well, the U.S. would be fine if we actually let immigration happen, right? So if we were back to pre-COVID immigration, we were 2.1. We were basically at replacement. Why
without immigration are we having less kids? Like literally everywhere.
Because the only people who are having kids are immigrants, right? So it's like the coastal elites, they have 1, maybe 2 kids. It's not gonna. You have to have more than 2 kids on average to increase the population.
And that's a transient phenomenon. Like the birth rates of those immigrant populations within a generation converge to the native one. And so you have to keep this constant. You get like 1 generation of increased fertility, and then it just converges to the mean. There's nothing special about immigrants that they're not particularly fertile forever. It's just they assimilate.
And is it basically that as women get more educated and get better opportunities in the workplace, the opportunity cost of having kids is higher, and thus they are less likely to want to have kids?
I wouldn't blame it on women necessarily.
I'm not blaming it on women. I'm just saying.
No. I would say there's also just a component of like, you live in a city, you get used to a certain lifestyle. Adding kids is expensive, and then adding the 3rd kid, like at a certain point, you're just like, okay, now I have to move to a different apartment, right? Like, and so I think that all starts to kind of weigh subtly, not subtly, but just kind of across the whole segment of society, right? Whereas everyone's living in the suburbs and housing is relatively cheap, and there's plenty of space outside, then maybe you're inclined to have that 3rd or 4th kid.
Yeah, wasn't there like a whole thing about how like getting the 3rd baby seat into a car was part of the reason why we were pegged to 2 children or something, because you add that extra 1 kid is like the soul breaker. I mean, I think what Dan is saying is certainly true and its factors in it, but like as an extreme counter argument, which just means that it's more complex. If you look at Nordic countries where there's endless subsidies to have families, the cost of living is so expensive, you still have fertility problems, which again, I think what you're saying is true in the context of the United States. It's a multi-factor phenomenon, but it's not like solving all those problems necessarily gets you there. I think there just has to be, and I hate just saying culture because it's this broad thing, but in Israel, for example, family does come first, right? Like I said, like I had a tweet go viral, which to me seemed almost like a cliche observation, but I was with a bunch of like startup dudes and going out having beers, the usual night out. They're all like younger than me. They're like in their late 20s, early 30s. They all of them were married, and then at least half of them had kids. Like they proceed, Israel enforces adulthood on you very quickly. You go to the army at 18, they put a rifle and they stick you in front at a checkpoint or in the Golan Heights, and suddenly you're a man at war, in battle, serving your nation with the team dynamic of that's birth. And as soon as you get out of that, you instantly want to get a college degree and you marry your sweetheart and have kids, like instantly. And if you don't, you're kind of seen as like living like a child. I don't know. It's just not normal, right? Like, what do you do on the weekends on Shabbat if not hang out with your family? What, go do yoga? It's like, it isn't the way it works, right? And so I think a lot of it is just familial, cultural, religious to a certain degree.
It's interesting you mention that, because I was talking with my wife recently about this, and that I'm in the cohort of like kind of mid-30s, like people are all having kids, and because I am one of these coastal elite types, and I find it fascinating that there's still this kind of like, oh, well, the adults are going to do this activity on the weekend and we can get a babysitter or do whatever. And it just feels a little weird to me, where it's like, I thought that was like the end of that chapter. And it's like, now we have kids and it's like, you do family oriented things. And I have to suspect that is a very American coastal phenomenon, which is then of course exported to the rest of the kind of Borg globally, of like, oh, like, well, I need something for me as an adult. It's like, what bullshit is that? Like, it's like your job is now to actually take care of your kids and have more kids. Like, I think, I don't know, there's something unnatural that it feels very childish.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think in Israel, you see it's a lot more, if you go to a social event, like everyone shows up with the kids and like sticks the kids in a corner and they go play and like, that's it. And I mean, there is a division between adult and childish life, as there necessarily has to be, because psychologically you're not the same type of person, but it doesn't mean you have to exclude children from life in some way. There's also obviously much more intergenerational families. You can live with a grandparent, you can live with friends. I mean, kids have a network effect. If everyone around you has kids roughly the same age, then everything becomes a lot easier, right? I'm just going to drop the kid off and then I'm going to do a thing, right? It doesn't become this whole production childcare. So,
yeah, I think the intergenerational thing is also something that, especially where you have the ambitious people in the United States move to these kind of power cities, San Francisco, New York, LA, DC, and you probably don't have your family local. It feels very unnatural, right? It's like you're raising the kid in that city, but then the grandparents are far away, and so you lose a lot of that kind of, God, I wanted to say Lindy, but just the kind of natural way of child rearing that's existed for millennia, right?
Are you guys optimistic that any of the proposed changes, whether it's increased childcare or better fertility benefits or fertility technology like artificial wombs, do you think anything, or even just paying people to have kids, are there any interventions that will reverse the trend?
My big thing is, I think status is what drives most of it, right? So if all of a sudden having 3 or 4 kids was seen as high status, which in some ways it actually kind of, if you kind of look at the really, really rich people, like they have a gaggle of kids, right? Whether you have like, Brangelina had the whole group of kids, Kim and Kanye, Elon has a lot of kids, I think Zuck has 3 kids. So I think at a high level, like obviously you have more resources and things like that. But I think if you were to make having more kids high status within elite circles, then you're going to get it. People are going to be willing to sacrifice their yoga and their expensive coffee to like be able to have more kids in there, whether it's get a bigger place or move somewhere else. I would have been optimistic that like the kind of like post-COVID remote work would encourage people to move to places where they could have more kids. But I think that was a fever dream. Like I think everyone's going back to the office. So I don't know. What do you think, Antonio?
Yeah, dude, I'm a good I diagnose things. I don't prescribe solutions, man. I don't know how to fix it. I think I'm kind of a cynic. I don't think it's hard to fix. I mean, look, what would it take, absent the moral implications, to actually make this happen? Imposing a certain religious morality, banning birth control, making promiscuous sexuality considered immoral. Look, I mean, there's so many. You could take us back to a Handmaid's Tale reality, and that would probably kick up the birth rate, right? I mean, we've done experiments with living in modernity, and some of those have gone very well, and I would consider them to be progress. Some of them, I don't know, have blown up in our faces, and you can see the results if you go out in San Francisco. I don't know. The other thing is that I don't know that a lot of the prescriptions you see today are literally basically various forms of nostalgia. I've often joked that where you're on the political spectrum is basically a function of what year you think the clock should be turned back to, right? And if you're like an Obama centrist, you say 2008. And if you're like a trad, you say 1950. If you're an ultra trad, you say 1650. If you're I don't know what, like it's always some age in the past was the ideal era. Nobody has a vision of the future. And again, other than technology, which as much as I love my tech bros and am one myself, it's like, that's a very narrow dimension that you're focused on. Like it is the material technology of a society. Like we have literally driverless cruises, like driving in front of our office, and it's super cool. Like all the tourists that come to watch the ball game, they sit there and take photos of it, right? And again, I think it's a net improvement, and I think we should all have autonomous vehicles.
Well,
But that
Paris
leaves-
Marx thinks we should be going to the streets and slashing the tires.
Dude, once again, my theory that like Tom Wolfe is running the script in heaven right now, a guy named Paris Marx is the biggest opponent to autonomous vehicles in San Francisco. If Wolfe had written that into a novel, they'd say, no, it's too unlikely. And here we are. Paris Marx's thoughts on AVs. Yeah.
I mean, speaking of tech, Dan, maybe let's segue into Farcaster. And maybe you can give us the update. You originally started Farcaster, I believe, around two principles. One is a uncensorable Twitter, and the other was a Twitter in which you could build, or social media where you could build applications on top of. Those are two things that Web2 social media didn't enable. You want to trace the evolution there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to bore you guys with all that, but I think one interesting thing. So I started it working on what is now Farcaster in 2020. And I think a lot of people told me, it was like, okay, what are you spending time on that? Like, you're not going to be able to displace the network effect of something like a Twitter. Well, obviously Elon showed up as the main character in this game and now has changed the kind of table, so to speak, in that you have a bunch of competing social networks for what is this idea of like Twitter, with Twitter still being the most relevant. I think I've said this on the show in the past. I just don't think that that's going away. Like, as much as people don't like Elon, the network effect of Twitter being Twitter is still going to be really strong. Maybe to like Eugene's point, it won't ever be the same as it was like peak 2020, where we're all at home, kind of just sitting and glued to Twitter and Clubhouse and whatever was trendy at the time. But I think in this new era, you are going to have people kind of at least more open-minded to trying something different. But I don't actually think you're going to get anyone who's high status on Twitter to change over to any of the new social networks. I mean, we've ragged on Threads plenty here, but I think where I've come in the last couple of years is like fundamentally, and maybe I should have had this up front, but you have to kind of go through it, is the only way something like Farcaster is going to work is if it enables things that are fundamentally new. And I can sit around twiddling my thumbs, hoping, because it is an open protocol and we're almost at the point where it's 100% permissionless, which that was been a goal from the beginning. But I think we fundamentally have to have some type of new type of social experience built on top of it if people are going to actually use it in any amount of scale. Otherwise, it's always going to be kind of some fringe, small minority of folks who are disgruntled about Twitter. And it's like, you don't actually want to build a social network as like anti-Elon. Like, I think we've already tried doing a bunch of those things and they just don't work. They attract the worst type of people. And rather, like, what's much more interesting is like paint a vision of the future, connecting back what we were talking about before, that is actually exciting and new, rather than something that is like, I'm going to try to bring you back to where we were in the past.
Okay, can I ask an annoying question, Dan? Which,
sure.
If this is becoming Web3 story hour, can we? Okay, so, and obviously, I'm actually one of the offenders of in the statement, but it's like one of the weird things about Web3 consumer, to the extent that it exists, is that we build so much infrastructure. I think it was Chris who coined the whole thing about the fat protocol thesis, where the values in the protocol, and that's certainly been true for some aspects of DeFi. But on the consumer, it's just odd to me that even to this day, you see new Web3 companies that's just infra on infra on infra. It's like the nth iteration of some weird DeFi protocol that does some weird funky thing that maybe is residually interesting, but it's not that interesting from a consumer perspective. And you don't see what you saw 10 years ago in like the Web2 bubble of like every person who could code a mobile app trying to create the next Instagram or something like it, right? And going out there and basically measuring their success in DAU and figuring out the business later. And somehow you don't see that level of like creative, destructive, stuff going on in Web3 consumer like you used to. And I'm not sure why.
Yeah, I have a pretty strong point of view on this. So just Chris didn't coin fat protocol thesis. This is a guy, Joel Monegro, who was working at Union Square Ventures. I've always disagreed with this because I actually think it's like a bane on the entire industry, in that it attracts people to think that, oh, I build the protocol. It's like Field of Dreams. Like, if you build it, they will come. And it's like Peter Thiel was the one that said that that's complete fallacy. And it's like, you need to do sales, right? And like, you need to actually convince people to come and use your thing. So that is like one thing that is holding crypto back. I think a second is, if you just kind of look at a pure money-making standpoint, the easiest way to make money in crypto is to launch a blockchain that has a native token. You keep some of that token and then you get other people to use it, because that's actually the kind of like, think of it as like the arcade token to actually like show up to the party. And so I think that model of just like, oh, I can build a better fundamental blockchain, nerd snipes so many smart people, and like you just have generations of people doing it, and there have been enough successes. There have been tons of different attempts at these blockchains. Like there's a whole term like professor coin, where it's like you just pull some smart, Israeli professor, math professor, or American, computer science professor, or cryptography, and it's like, let's invent a blockchain that's that much more scalable. And they kind of launch, and then you inevitably go through an upcycle, and everyone pumps that coin as being like the next big thing. Actually, Gary Gensler, the chairman of the SEC, was an advisor, or was basically pumping one of these professor coins, Algorand, during the last kind of like, not this past cycle, but the previous. And so I think that is the issue, is so you have a ton of interest in creating a blockchain, because it's like you can just get people to increase the price of it by using it somewhat, you can make a lot of money. So you have a whole bunch of people attempt that, and then it naturally leads itself to, well, I'm not going to build the blockchain, but I'm going to build the layer of infrastructure on top of it and the layers of abstraction, rather than if for example, let's say everything had consolidated around Bitcoin or Ethereum early on and no one else had attempted it. I think we would have moved way farther up the stack, where the infrastructure actually would have been pretty built out. And then you get to a point where, okay, the only way to make money here is actually building apps. But what's interesting is most of the infrastructure companies in my 10 years in crypto have been zeros, right? So it's like, it's kind of almost like a midwit thing, where during the boom times, everyone's like, oh man, if the infrastructure was just better, then we would have all these other apps. I'm going to sell the picks and shovels to these other people. And people always kind of lumped Coinbase into that element, but like people forget, it's like Coinbase has 100 million customers. Coinbase is an app that you use. It's a trading app, right? So it's infrastructure, but that it actually has a retail component to it. And so what you have is you have all these people, they start the company during the bull market. They raise a bunch of money, they get writing their code, and then the market falls out, and then it's like, wait, okay, we're ready to launch our product in the kind of bear market, right? And so I mean, you're going through this now, like during the bear market, to be able to actually be really savvy, get the deals done, keep the momentum for your kind of product, assuming you believe in that infrastructure. As the market picks back up and then inevitably more developers show back up, you're going to be in the right place at the right time. And those are the companies that have done really well. Alchemy being probably the best example of a pure infra company, started in a previous cycle, made it through the whole, bear market, and then came out the other side as an extremely valuable infrastructure company. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant.
I thought that was great.
I don't know, man. What's the equivalent of like photo filters? Remember when everyone tried to create a fucking photo filter app and Instagram somehow won? There isn't that ruthless competition on the Web3 consumer space.
They tend to be speculative assets, right? So you have NFTs, you have tokens, you have, there's something called Friend Tech that just launched, where it's like social tokens, which is BitClout like 18 months ago did that. So you have some de jour version of speculation, but I think we have yet to have an app built on top of this kind of whole stack that is a breakout, that is not rooted directly in the financialization of the kind of crypto behind it. And actually, I think one of the things that I've been excited about building Farcaster from the beginning is like, there is no explicit financial element to Farcaster, the protocol, nor the app that we're building, Warpcast. And my belief is like, if we can actually build something that is useful on its own, that is not only like a much more sustainable way to grow long term, but also I think it benefits crypto, because it actually shows people, it's like, oh, this is the pattern that you want to go copy. And so you get a bunch of other people who go and do it. I think it's also underrated how impactful Apple's packaging of the App Store was for the kind of 2010s in terms of all the growth that came out of that. Because if you think of like smartphones or, phones before, like the types of people who were building like mobile apps prior to the iPhone were like, they were selling you ringtone. It was pretty scammy, right? Like it was a whole ecosystem of like really overpriced, scammy stuff that once you got this like really nice environment, and Apple did an amazing job getting, hundreds of millions of people, billions of people with an iPhone, and then Android, obviously, it became such a big market that it attracted people who could actually build like the Instagrams and all these, WhatsApps and things like that. What do you think, Antonio, the Elon Zuck thing?
I think you just fucking fight or shut up already. That's what I think.
So you're in the Zuck camp.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to do it, do it. I mean, I just don't understand. I don't know. Yeah, I don't want to get into the weeds of it, but like Elon's pretending as if he's planning things, and apparently he wasn't talking to Zuck at all about it. And Zuck's like, okay, look, game on, just name the date, and then suddenly I don't know. It's weird that Walter Isaacson posted, I guess, the thread in which it's like, I don't understand. He's obviously a confidant because he's writing a book about Elon, and yet he's divulging a text thread, something I would never do. I don't know. The whole thing is fucking weird, man. Like,
I think it's all big mind games from Elon. I think
he got permission. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Elon's trying to do a big mind game here. Maybe that's 4D chess.
I thought it made Elon look bad, but Paul Scalise tweeted, Elon is totally controlling the frame. Zuck is complaining, looking like the beta. But
maybe to bring it up a little bit more, kind of intellectually. What do you think it says about society, Antonio, that we're like caring about the text messages between two billionaire tech founders, like potentially fighting for charity in the Coliseum? Like, what? I don't know. I guess we're just bored. Like, we have nothing better to do.
Well, here's a piece of civilizational decay and barbarism that at least is somewhat amusing, and at least Roman in its grandeur, right? Yes, let's have what's his name, the gladiatorial emperor who scandalized Rome by actually getting into the arena. Why not? I think it's definitely a check on the virtualized bullshit of online to actually take a fist in the face. So yeah, I think I'd be for it.
My favorite part is, my favorite thing is like they got the Prime Minister of Italy or something permission, and I'm just like, this is what the Prime Minister of Italy is doing, is he's giving permission to use the Coliseum at this point. Like, imagine showing like this whole scenario to Augustus to be like, this is what Rome will become, is you're a tourist attraction for rich Americans to fight in the Coliseum so that they can make their kind of like online streaming platforms. It's just, I think it's really funny.
It would be the biggest media event of the year, and I think it should happen. And my money is on Zuck, by the way. I think Mark is gonna totally take Elon.
You don't think the size advantage is big enough?
Zuck is pretty ripped, and he just has better training and better fitness too. His fitness is incredible. Didn't he do that military challenge with like the weighted vest and all that shit? That was like a world-class time. The guy's actually in amazing shape. Elon just isn't. Right.
Yeah, I think that I'm not an expert on boxing, but everything I know is like there's a reason they have the heavyweight categorization and the lightweight. Like, weight is actually a pretty big factor here, more so than like shape, training. But maybe Zuck can just like topple Elon, right? Like one quick swipe of the legs or something, and then once he's on the floor, the size advantage doesn't matter.
I think the weight thing matters if you assume athletes, if you're on the efficient frontier of peak performance, then that weight thing matters. But like, whatever weight I'm not going to say it publicly. I don't think I have a huge advantage against a flyweight boxer. I think I'm still going to get my ass kicked, right? Because we're not really comparing apples with apples, right? I would probably be a super heavyweight in the boxing division, and I'm not comparable to a Mike Tyson, right? And I'm not going to have Tyson's advantage over that flyweight or that bantamweight boxer, right? So, and yes, if there was a Zuck of Elon's weight, I would agree with you, but that's not what we're discussing. So I would, and I think it would turn into a grappling fest, and then Zuck would just totally win, and they would force Elon to tap out, and that's it.
Yeah, that's probably right, but I hope it happens. I mean, what an event.
My last comment is just that physically, it would actually be an upgrade to the existing culture. As barbaric as it is, and it is a little barbaric to be seeing two Titans literally beat the shit out of each other, I think morally it would actually be an upgrade. But that said, I think we should bring dueling back. and I think, getting in the ring with your antagonist should actually be like a legal thing that we condone as a society. So,
speaking of the other big thing that happened regarding a former Titan is that SBF is back in jail. And it looks like...
do you know the story here?
No, tell the story.
What's the story?
Oh man, it's so great. So he basically gets home. He starts using a VPN, which like that was prohibited, and like they had like an instance where he like watched, I want to say it was like he watched the Super Bowl from the VPN, like he was in the Bahamas, because like he didn't, I don't know, it was just something so inane and dumb. And he leaked the diary from his ex-girlfriend Caroline to the New York Times. And then there was like some argument of like how he leaked it. It's like made the New York Times reporter like view it on his laptop because he wouldn't send it. But then the New York Times had to write like a defense piece of him saying that it was like totally justified that SBF was going to give the reporter access to the diary. So that they were kind of like simping for SBF. And then he also like tried to harass like the former general counsel or chief compliance officer or something. So the judge was like, fuck you, like this is against the bail, and sent him back to jail. So he's back in the clink.
So SBF is obviously a sociopath who can't even follow basic rules and thinks he's above the law, clearly, even when like his ass is basically on the line. And two, does that mean he actually has to forfeit the $250 million bail? What happens? Didn't his parents put up the house or something as part of that bond?
Yeah, you're right. I don't know enough about bail law. Like, maybe it's only if you skip bail, but yeah, that's crazy. If that, they have to pay the house. It sounds like they're scummy people. So,
yeah, they're Stanford professors, terrible people. That's
my heart goes out for him. Martin Shkreli had a tweet that was like, or had some advice for SBF that was like, lower your voice, learn rap music, like be familiar with urban areas. I mean,
yo, he was going off on it. He was explaining. He's like, some guy was giving an opinion. He's like, I know more about federal sentencing guidelines than you'd ever want to know. Like, it was like pretty.
Dude, it's Shkreli season, guys.
Yeah, dude, he reply guide me. Like, I mean, we should probably have him on the pod at some point.
Antonio's dubious, but he's back, man. He's healed his image. He's an entrepreneur.
Who's more canceled, Martin Shkreli or Hanania?
I think they're both back.
Eric is willing to talk to anyone who's been canceled at any point, as long as it's growing Turpentine media.
We have a show called In the Arena for people who've been through big crises, but Martin went on it. It was a great episode. We had someone from Firefest come on. We had someone from FTX. I mean, these are interesting stories.
Machiavelli had a famous quote that he said that if he was given the choice between heaven and hell, between living with, saints and monks and ascetics, or, warriors and adventures and whatnot in hell, he would pick hell. Could it be more interesting? I think some vision of Machiavellian hell is you show up and it's like Shkreli and Hanania and the Fire Festival guy, and they're all in one room. And that is, and then an SBF, and that's the elevator you're stuck in.
Yep.
All right, I got to run.
Let's wrap on that. Great stuff, guys.